Hey hola bonjour namaste. Welcome to my channel Top 5 today where we bring out various interesting top 5 countdowns that expands your knowledge and helps you to learn the world far better. Today's topic is capital punishment, exploring history's most notorious forms of execution. A topic that has stirred debates and controversies throughout history. In this video, we will delve into the practice of capital punishment and explore 5 of the most infamous methods of execution that have existed throughout time. The video is divided into 2 parts. Part 1, where we understand what it is and its purpose as a legal sanction, presenting arguments both for and against the use of death penalty along with highlighting the international human rights standards regarding capital punishment. Part 2 of the video presents you with the top 5 capital punishments that existed. Disclaimer: this video aims to provide an educational overview of capital punishment and its historical forms. It does not endorse or promote any particular viewpoint on the subject. Let us begin. Capital punishment, also known as the death penalty, refers to the practice of legally executing an individual as a punishment for committing a serious crime. It is a form of punishment carried out by a government or authorized judicial authority through various methods. The purpose of capital punishment as a legal sanction varies across different legal systems and societies. Some of the commonly stated purposes are: 1. Retribution. Capital punishment is seen as a means to achieve retributive justice, seeking to balance the scales by imposing a severe penalty on individuals who have committed heinous crimes. Supporters argue that it provides a sense of closure and satisfaction to the victims and their families by exacting punishment proportional to the severity of the crime. 2. Deterrence. Another purpose of capital punishment is deterrence, aiming to discourage potential offenders from committing similar crimes. Proponents argue that the fear of facing the ultimate penalty of death may deter individuals from engaging in serious criminal activities. 3. Incapacitation. Capital punishment permanently removes individuals convicted of capital crimes from society. By executing offenders, the threat they pose to public safety is eliminated, preventing them from causing further harm to others. 4. Moral and symbolic statement. Some proponents of capital punishment argue that it serves as a moral and symbolic statement against the most severe crimes. It reflects society's condemnation of acts deemed morally repugnant and reaffirms the sanctity of human life by responding with the ultimate penalty for those who have intentionally taken another life. 5. Cost and resources. In some cases, proponents of capital punishment argue that it saves costs and resources by avoiding the long-term expenses associated with incarcerating individuals for life without parole. The legal status of capital punishment varies significantly across countries and regions around the world. Here is an overview of the varying legal statuses of capital punishment globally. 1. Abolitionist countries. Over 100 countries have abolished the death penalty for all crimes. These countries have either completely eliminated capital punishment from their legal systems or have instituted a formal or de facto moratorium on executions. Examples of countries that have abolished the death penalty include Canada, Australia, most countries in Europe, and many Latin American and African nations. 2. Abolitionist in practice. Some countries retain the death penalty in their laws but have not carried out executions for a significant period or have established a policy of not implementing the death penalty in practice. These countries are considered abolitionist in practice. For example, countries like South Africa, Russia, and Nepal fall into this category. 3. Retentionist countries. Approximately 50 countries still retain capital punishment and continue to carry out executions. These countries include China, the United States, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Pakistan, and several others. They have legal frameworks that allow for the imposition of the death penalty, and executions may occur regularly or sporadically. 4. Moratoriums and reform. In some retentionist countries, there have been efforts to limit or reform the use of the death penalty. They may have introduced moratoriums on executions, reduced the number of crimes eligible for capital punishment, or initiated discussions about its abolition or restriction. These countries may be in transitional phases regarding their approach to capital punishment. The international trend leans toward the gradual abolition of the death penalty, with increased recognition of human rights and concerns about wrongful convictions and the irreversibility of capital punishment. Arguments against the use of the death penalty. 1. Human rights and dignity. Opponents argue that the death penalty violates the inherent right to life and the prohibition of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. They assert that every individual, regardless of their actions, possesses a fundamental right to life and should not be subjected to state-sanctioned killing. 2. Irreversibility and fallibility. Capital punishment carries the risk of executing innocent individuals. Despite advances in forensic science and legal procedures, there have been cases of wrongful convictions. Critics contend that since the death penalty is irreversible, any miscarriage of justice is a grave and irreversible mistake. 3. Ineffectiveness as a deterrent. Some studies suggest that the death penalty may not act as an effective deterrent against crime. Critics argue that potential offenders are not deterred by the severity of the punishment. An alternative. Forms of punishment, such as life imprisonment without parole, can achieve the same level of deterrence without the moral implications. 4. Potential for biases and discrimination. Critics point out that the death penalty is disproportionately applied to marginalized and disadvantaged groups, including racial and ethnic minorities, the economically disadvantaged, and those without adequate legal representation. This raises concerns about fairness, equal protection under the law, and the potential for racial and socio-economic biases to influence the outcomes of capital cases. It's important to note that these arguments reflect different perspectives and viewpoints on the death penalty. The ongoing debate surrounding capital punishment takes into account moral, ethical, legal, and societal considerations, as well as evolving understandings of justice and human rights. Finally, highlighting the international human rights standards regarding capital punishment. International human rights standards regarding capital punishment emphasize the protection of the right to life and the prohibition of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. These standards are reflected in various international instruments and agreements. Here are some key highlights. 1. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. The UDHR states in Article 3 that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. While the UDHR does not explicitly mention the death penalty, it is widely interpreted as endorsing the right to life and opposing arbitrary deprivation of life. 2. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR. The ICCPR, which came into force in 1976, reinforces the right to life and provides more detailed provisions regarding capital punishment. Article 6 of the ICCPR recognizes the inherent right to life and specifies that the death penalty may only be imposed for the most serious crimes, in accordance with the law and following a fair trial. It also sets out safeguards, such as the right to seek pardon or commutation and the prohibition of torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. 3. Second Optional Protocol to the ICCPR. This protocol, adopted in 1989, aims to abolish the death penalty worldwide. It calls for the abolition of the death penalty within the jurisdiction of states parties and prohibits the resumption of executions. It has been ratified by a significant number of countries, though not universally. 4. Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, CAT. The CAT, which entered into force in 1987, explicitly prohibits torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. It has been interpreted to include the prohibition of imposing the death penalty in a manner that amounts to torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. 5. Regional human rights instruments. Various regional human rights instruments, such as the European Convention on Human Rights, the American Convention on Human Rights, and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, also have provisions related to capital punishment. These instruments either restrict or call for the abolition of the death penalty and ensure respect for human rights in the context of capital punishment. The international human rights standards aim to promote the protection of the right to life, ensure fair trials, and prevent the imposition of cruel, inhuman, or degrading punishment. They encourage countries to move towards the abolition of the death penalty and establish safeguards to protect individuals' rights when capital punishment is still in use. Now let us come to the part 2 of the video, which is even more interesting when we learn about the types and cruel ways in which people were sentenced to capital punishment throughout history. Though I do not like modern society and rotten people mindset, but am thankful that at least modernism helped getting more concern about us as humans and changed the ways as of how a person should be sentenced in relating to the punishment and death. Let's begin unveiling history's most brutal capital punishments, top 5 infamous forms of execution. Number 5. The rack torture. The majority of torture devices were created and used throughout the Middle Ages, which were known for their cruelty, suffering, and misery. There have been several torture devices that are renowned for the intensity of agony they subjected victims to, but none as horrific as the rack torture device. The rack of torture device was a rectangular wooden or iron frame which was usually raised from the ground with a roller at one or both ends. The victim's wrists and ankles were chained to the rollers, and as the interrogation progressed, a handle and cord mechanism attached to the top roller was used to gradually retract the chains. It gradually increased the strain on the prisoner's shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows, all the while causing excruciating pain. By means of pulleys and levers, the roller could be rotated on its own axis, thus straining the ropes until the victim's joints were dislocated and eventually separated from the body. Additionally, when muscle fibers were stretched excessively, they lost their ability to contract, rendering them ineffective. The rack torture device was so gruesome that even if the individual's joints weren't dislocated or torn from their sockets, the victim would be maimed and, in some cases, paralyzed for the rest of their life. Rack torture device was initially a system of ropes and pulleys, but modifications were made over the centuries throughout Europe. In France, spikes were added to the rack to increase the victim's suffering. As the victims were put on the rack, the spikes dug into their back and further into the spinal cord while their limbs were stretched out. If you think that the previous description of the rack torture was torturous, Russia's version of the device was devil's hell. Russia had its own form of the rack where the victims were hanged by their chained hands. The suspension allowed for the individual to be stretched out while being whipped and having candles applied to different parts of their body. This form of medieval torture device, the rack, was also used during the Inquisition period. However, there was an excruciating addition of violently dropping and raising the victim until their joints shattered. But when was the rack torture device used? According to historians, the use of the rack torture device was first done in antiquity, and the earliest examples are from Greece. The Greeks may have been the first to use the rack to torture enslaved people and non-citizens. The torture device has been used in situations of standard charges like blasphemy and heresy. Eventually, witchcraft and other crimes against religion and morality were also included, although the crimes were not exclusively confined to religion. While in Britain, the device was used as an instrument to extract information. After the first half of the 17th century, the practice continued in other European countries and Russia, where it was also used during the 18th century. The spread of Enlightenment ideals and the Age of Reason eventually overcame this fanaticism of the medieval times torture devices. Who invented the torture rack? In 1420, John Holland, the second Duke of Exeter, introduced the rack torture device during the Middle Ages. The Duke famously used it to torture women and thus earned the device the nickname, the Duke of Exeter's daughter. The Duke also infamously used the torture device on the Catholic martyr Nicholas Owen and the Protestant saint Anne Askew. And Askew was reportedly so stretched out after the torture that she had to be carried to her execution. Guy Fawkes of the infamous 5th of November gunpowder plot was also said to be a victim of the torture device. The rack torture device was nothing less than a savage attack on a person's bodily and mental faculties. It is a type of torture that elevates physical punishment to a whole new level and causes one to lose faith in others. Thankfully, the Treason Act passed in Britain in 1708 outlawed the use of torture. However, until the United Nations Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel or Degrading Treatment or Punishment was passed in 1984, the punishment was not formally prohibited anywhere. Number 4. Raped by wild animal to death. People in the ancient Roman Empire enjoyed a good show. Nothing creates a finer spectacle than seeing animals attack and kill humans. Particularly if it was a woman, she would be raped by specifically trained wild creatures until she passed away, just like poor Locusta's fate forced her to endure. You surely want to know about this person Locusta. So, coming to that, from ancient Roman times is the tale of a notorious woman who in AD 54, 1st century if you need a timeline, became the first serial killer ever to achieve infamy. Meet the medieval scientist Locusta of Gaul, the evil genius of Roman civilization who lived during the reign of Emperor Nero. The same one who fiddled while he watched Rome burn. The story is about 3 characters from Rome, Emperor Nero, his mother Agrippina, and Locusta, the woman the two conspired with to kill Nero's father Emperor Claudius. Claudius was the dumbwit emperor. No, we are not being condescending, it's his mother's own assessment when she compared others with her son. He is a bigger fool even than my son Claudius, she would say. So, we get the idea. Agrippina was Claudius' wife and their married life was a disaster, to put it subtly. Nero was their son and the rightful heir of the Roman Empire after Emperor Claudius. But Agrippina wanted the throne to come to her son Nero sooner. It was an act of treason. Empress Agrippina got her husband killed in a plot to crown her son Nero as the new emperor. To carry out the act, Agrippina got together with Locusta, who mastered the science, of poisoning her victims. Agrippina and Locusta killed Claudius with a batch of poison mushrooms. And that's how Nero became the emperor. Under Nero's reign, Locusta extended her pleasure of killing people, poisoning her victims at her will and becoming a sorceress of clandestine practices. Knowing her reality, Emperor Nero issued more contracts to her to kill his rivals. Thus, Locusta lived merrily in Nero's reign. Over the years, the emperor lavished her with land, money, gifts, and full pardon from all the ghastly crimes she had been charged with. Locusta soon became an agent of death by poison, getting contracts and assignments. She took her practice to the next level. She became a state-funded contract killer, the first of her kind ever in human history. She also started a school to teach poisoning. Consequences. The Roman Senate decided to bring down Emperor Nero for his rogue practices, but Nero took his life in 64 AD, with his own dagger before he could be punished. Left without her protector, Locusta's time came to pay for her sins, and it is said that Locusta was ordered by the Senate to be publicly raped by a specially trained giraffe and then torn apart by wild animals. Story of Locusta the sorceress, who was raped to death by a giraffe, did rounds for a long time as the infamous legend, but there's another legend where she was led in chains through the whole city and then executed. Locusta holds the title of history's first recorded serial killer for poisoning and murdering thousands. She poisoned for pleasure and for gain, eventually becoming one of the most intriguing characters in Roman history. Number 3. Impalement. There were several variations of impalement. The pole might be pushed through someone's body, as appears to be the case in the picture, or through the vagina, or anus. Going through the body was generally a fast death, so that version was probably only used for displaying a corpse. The vagina system was only available for half the populace, and therefore the most common system was probably anal impalement. You're probably imagining a sharpened wooden spike being pushed up, but you'd be wrong. You wanted the pole to be blunt, to avoid piercing any organs and killing the victim too quickly. The entire point was to give the victim plenty of time to regret his or her crimes. Here's how it worked. A smooth, thick pole with a narrowed, but blunt, top end would be embedded in the ground. If you think of a width you can barely get the fingers of both hands around, you're probably about right. The height of the pole is carefully adjusted so the top is slightly higher than the victim's behind, when standing on tiptoes. It's a bit like hanging, where you adjust the rope length for the weight of the victim, but in this case we adjust the pole for height. The pole and the entry point are then smeared with fat or grease. The victim is held above the pole and placed down on it. If the width doesn't quite fit, that's not a problem, simply use a knife to slit from the anus towards the genitals until we have a snug fit. Now the victim is lowered down until they can stand on their own feet on tiptoes. You see why the pole height varies per person. The pole is in, and the victim can't step off because even on tippy toes, too much of the pole is inside, but to keep it from going further in, the victim has to stand there, and stand, and stand. 4 days. They can't keep this up forever. Eventually their feet slip a trifle, or they sag, and the pole slips further in. Because it's blunt, it pushes organs to the side as it penetrates. With every slippage, there's a tear and a little more blood loss, weakening the victim, making it harder to stand, so the pole pushes further in, and so on in a vicious cycle. The grease and fat and blood trickling down the pole would have attracted flies and other insects, which would have eaten their way into the wound to add to the torture. Whingy, bleeding heart, soft-on-crime liberals began to complain that anal impalement was too cruel. I can't imagine why. So they introduced the soft option of crucifixion. Crucifixion was an instant hit and eventually replaced anal impalement altogether, until it was revived centuries later by that well-known traditionalist, Vlad the Impaler. Number 2. Sawed in half. A saw is a pretty handy tool. For humans, it cuts wood; for mosquitoes, it cuts into humans with fantastic precision; and for sawfish, it allows them to look ridiculous for our entertainment. Thanks, God. But the saw is far more versatile than that, which is why one of history's most imaginably vile torture and execution methods, innovatively named the saw itself spread all over the world across the centuries until surprisingly recently. But I want to go into some of the fascinating history first. Simply, death by sawing is accomplished by sawing a human until they're dead. But this in itself lacks imagination. No, we needed to consider the most optimal, painful way to do this. Where to start? Sawing a human's head off would be too immediate, as would sawing top down from the skull. There would be no point sawing any further once you got a fraction of the way through the brain. Sawing across the midriff would be pretty agonizing and also lead to a sustained death as you watch the victim's guts spill over the floor and the blood drain from their face. But this draining caused a problem: the victim would pass out too quickly and escape from all the joyous torture. The best method, some found, was to hang a victim upside down and saw them in half lengthways, from the groin to the head. Being upside down allows the sawing to continue at least as far as the chest before death prevails, and all that blood going to the head allowed consciousness to stick around a bit longer. The bonus result is that the onlookers got to watch the victim's own blood and guts droop down and drench their body and face, intestines slapping around and more. Reasons for sawing differ through history. It's not only those praised by God who get the opportunity to have their mortal bodies torn asunder. It's hard to say when death by saw was actually first devised, but I can say with fair confidence that it was within the week of saws being invented, which was possibly around the 17th century BC, almost 4,000 years ago. There are numerous examples of Persian sawgutting, including when Parysatis, wife of Darius II, 423 BC, had her daughter-in-law's sibling sawn in half, when Hormizd IV had to watch his wife and son sawn in half, and when Sicelmius, leader of the brutal Thracians tribe, sawed a whole bunch of people in half and had their family members eat the remains. This eating of decapitated loved ones is surprisingly common in history. But Persia wasn't the only place of ancient times that enjoyed such heinous acts. It's fair to say that sawing people in half has historically been a popular endeavor. The problem is, it's frustratingly tricky. The body, whether alive or dead, tends to flop around in either panic or flaccidity, so it can be more annoying than ecstatic. The Chinese had a workaround for this by crushing the victim between two planks of wood first before commencing the sawing, or death by 1,000 cuts. But nowadays it's just easier, for the most part, to stab and shoot. I have no doubt, however, that in some war-torn regions where accounts of people being forced to eat each other, yes, that happens today, we might possibly also expect to see some sawing action going on. But there is so much going on out there, right now, that we are completely oblivious to that this post can only serve as a brief glimpse of a reminder of it. Number 1. Flaying. A method of torture or execution used most often in ancient and medieval times. Flaying occurs when a person's skin is removed, usually while they are still alive. Flaying was most popular in African and Asian countries centuries ago, though instances are found in most parts of the world. Flaying was usually used to punish or execute prisoners, but was also sometimes used to gather information. Despite occurring on different continents, the basic process of flaying is the same. A prisoner was tied, stretched out, with their hands over their head and their feet together. Normally starting with the face, the torturer would use a small knife to peel the skin off the body in one solid piece. This process was very slow and painful, and victims usually died before the torturer had flayed them to the waist. Sometimes victims were left in the sun or boiled in hot water first in order to make the skin removal easier. Flaying was usually used in ritual sacrifice, on criminals, enemy soldiers, deposed rulers, and even witches. When used in ritual sacrifice, such as with the ancient Aztecs, the victims were normally already dead when their skins were removed. Other cultures put the flayed skin to use. For example, the Assyrians would nail the intact skin of their enemies to the wall after flaying them alive. In medieval Europe, flaying was seen more as cutting off sections of flesh rather than the whole body. It was not one of the most popular methods of torture in Europe, but it was sometimes used to gather information. For example, some Babington conspirators, those who were part of a plot to assassinate England's Queen Elizabeth I in order to free Mary, Queen of Scots, from captivity in 1586, were flayed for information regarding the plot. In China, flesh was sometimes just removed from the face rather than the whole body. In 1396, however, the first emperor of the Ming dynasty, Hongwu, had 5,000 women flayed. Additionally, he flayed many servants and enemies during his reign. Though uncommon in the United States, flaying does occur in its history. Possibly the most famous example is of Nat Turner. Nat Turner, a slave, led a slave rebellion in 1831 and was subsequently hung and then flayed. Flaying is now illegal in every part of the world. Unfortunately, it is still seen even in the early 21st century. For example, in 2000, government troops in Myanmar allegedly flayed every male in the village of Karenni. What does flayed mean? To be flayed refers to removing the skin as a method of torture, and another way to talk about flaying is being skinned alive. Though not a standard form of suffering, it began as a routine option during the early Middle Ages and lasted well into the 21st century. A person was first captured and then restrained by being bound and tied without clothes on their body. Often the method of restraint was either by the hanging of hands and feet to spread the limbs apart or on a larger butcher block to contain the blood. Then the designated torturer, usually the same person who held the job of the executioner, would begin flaying the skin. The skin was removed in one large piece while the person restrained was still alive in many cases. In other instances, only skin parts would be removed to gain information through torture without ultimately killing the prisoner. If the person was sentenced to whole body flaying, they often died from blood loss and shock before completing the entire process. The process was also typically a public display, with dozens of onlookers viewing the gruesome task. Who got flaying torture? There was no designated crime and punishment system when flaying was first instituted. As a result, it would be prescribed as a punishment at will and whenever people saw fit. It was mainly reserved for extreme or heinous crimes, though not always. There is some record of flaying originating in Asian and African cultures, though the English did their fair share of flaying too. On some occasions, flaying was not considered as torture, exactly. Instead, flaying was central to how ritual sacrifices or ceremonies were conducted. These differentiations make flaying no less horrific, other than in some cases, like the Aztecs, where those flayed were already dead before the process began. What happened to flayed skin? When flayed skin was removed, it served many different purposes. It might have covered a vase or an urn in ancient times, like traditional leather. The use of skin as an offering or adornment was part of the ritual nature of flaying. However, Assyrians would use the flayed skins of their enemies as reminders of battle victories on their walls. Several heads of state used flayed skin as a messenger. An early king of England once had 3 monks who had robbed the treasury of Westminster Abbey flayed. Later their skin was hung on the doors to remind thieves of the punishments that awaited them before hell. King Philip IV of France had purveyors of extramarital affairs to the throne not only flayed but castrated and beheaded and then displayed on the gallows as a warning to others. Serial killers and murderers also use flaying as a method of torturing victims. Some instances of flaying are evident in the heinous stories of torture from murderer Ed Gein. His affinity for flaying as a method of torture was from a self-reported fascination with the horrors of Nazi Germany death camps. Murderers who flayed their victims include Vlad the Impaler, Joseph Mengele, Jeffrey Dahmer, Delphine Lalaurie, and others. Do people survive skin flaying? If flaying were used as a means to gather information through torture, then sometimes the victims would survive afterward if they were adequately treated with medical care and if the wounds were not too critical. If they waited too long to divulge important information and were missing too much skin, the body might have already gone into shock or hypothermia. In that case, the chances of recovery were low thanks to the lack of modern medicine available to prisoners and the harsh conditions in captivity. If flaying was used as a method of torture with the intent to remove the entire covering of skin in one piece, the prisoner did not often make it through the whole flaying before dying. The body will go into shock long before the skin is totally removed. Does flaying still exist? Currently, flaying is illegal worldwide and is considered a violation of human rights and a war crime. However, there have been reports of flaying as a common illegal activity amongst murderers and as a method of torture. Those found guilty of flaying are currently serving criminal sentences or the like. Reported as a war crime, flaying was in circulation as recently as 2000 to 2018, despite international interventions. In the early 2000s, amid civil war, government troops in Myanmar violated international human rights by allegedly flaying all the males in a village in Karenni in Burma. Bonus capital punishments. 1. The brazen bull. Designed by the ancient Greeks, this method was also called the Sicilian bull, as it was invented in Sicily. This was a device made of bronze, in the shape and size of an actual bull. The condemned person would be locked inside and fire would be set beneath the bull, heating the bronze till the person inside got roasted to death. This device also had such systems that converted screams of the condemned into the bellows of a bull. 2. Using rats to kill. Torturing or killing people using rats still remains a favorite method among people, but in early times it was more so. There was a thing called rat trap where a rat would be put inside a cage. The bottomless cage would be placed on a convict's body, torso, generally, and the other side of the cage would be heated. The poor rat, finding the other side blocked by the heat, would slowly eat away the victim's flesh to make way for itself. 3. The breaking wheel. Another classical mode of executing capital punishment was by using the breaking wheel. This extremely simple device consisted of a wheel, to which the convicted would be tied, and sometimes of spikes. The convicted would have his limbs beaten with a club or a cudgel, and with the turning of the wheel, the bones in his body would slowly break, leading to an excruciatingly painful death. 4. Crushed under the elephant. Capital punishment by the convicts had being crushed under an elephant was a very popular method in ancient India, and also in other parts of Southeast Asia. Elephants were trained to kill their victims immediately or to torture them slowly over a period of time in this public spectacle. Sometimes, believe me, rarely, the elephants were made to just dismember the convict and not completely kill him. In conclusion, exploring history's most notorious forms of execution has provided us with a harrowing glimpse into the dark side of human nature and the various methods societies have used to enforce capital punishment. Through this exploration, we have witnessed the cruelty and brutality that existed in the past, and it serves as a stark reminder of the importance of valuing human life and promoting more humane methods of justice in the present. Capital punishment has been a part of human civilization for centuries, and it has been shaped by cultural, religious, and social factors. From the ancient methods of flaying and sawing to the more recent forms of execution such as the electric chair and lethal injection, each method carries its own level of horror and raises ethical questions about the justifiability of taking a life as punishment. While some argue that capital punishment serves as a deterrent and a means of retribution, the inherent flaws and irreversible nature of execution raise significant concerns. Wrongful convictions, potential biases, and the possibility of executing innocent individuals highlight the inherent fallibility of the justice system and the irreversible consequences of taking a life. Moreover, as societies evolve and progress, there has been a growing international consensus against capital punishment. Many countries have abolished it altogether, recognizing the need to move towards more humane alternatives that focus on rehabilitation and justice rather than vengeance. Ultimately, exploring history's most notorious forms of execution should prompt us to critically reflect on the nature of punishment and our responsibility as a society. It is crucial to continue questioning the efficacy, morality, and fairness of capital punishment, striving towards a justice system that upholds the principles of human rights, compassion, and the possibility of redemption. Only by doing so can we create a future where the inherent dignity and value of every human life are truly respected. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. I'll see you in the next one, while requesting that it takes time and energy to create content like this, so if only you can show a little support. Thanks. Adios.